What's up everyone, China Cycling here with a look at this, the Ridge power meter from Magene. At $240 for the Ultegra version, it's cheap. But is it accurate? Is it reliable? Is it easy to install? Let's find out. So back in March when I visited Magene's headquarters in Qingdao, they were working hard on this power meter. Their laboratory is super impressive, and their engineers were hard at work refining the prototypes of the Ridge. While I was there, the unit was mostly just undergoing testing and minimal tweaking. So, I finally got my hands on a finished production unit. I installed this one on my teammate Marcus's bike. All of my own bikes run SRAM carbon cranks. And right now the power meter is only available for Shimano aluminium cranksets, from 6800 series Ultegra through to 9100 Dura Ace. So this went on Marcus's bike. Fortunately, Marcus is an endurance beast, averaging about 400 kilometers of riding a week. So we've already got around 2,500 kilometers on this thing. Marcus also has a set of Garmin Vector 3 pedals, which let us compare two datasets. You have three main choices when buying it. You can buy the entire crankset complete with the chain rings and the power meter already installed on the left crank arm. You can buy just the left crank arm with the power meter already installed, which is what I have here. Or if you're in China, you can send them your crank arm and they'll install the unit on the crank arm for you. They mostly do this if you have some rare crank arms, maybe super short or super long, etc. For most people though, they're going to already own a bike with Ultegra or Dura Ace, and they're going to just want to buy this crank arm. Changing a Shimano crank arm is super easy. I'd say if you're skilled enough to repair a flat, you can install this yourself. You'll need one special tool, which is the Shimano crankset tool, but most bike toolkits have got this tool, and most certainly all bike shops do. First, you need to remove your old crank arm. Just loosen the two bolts holding the crank arm on, then remove the big bolt using the special Shimano tool. Once that's done, the important bit that everyone forgets is to flick up the little tab. I used a small 2mm hex key to do this. Once that little tab's flicked up, a bit of wriggling and pulling should get the crank arm off. Then installing your new crank arm is just the reverse. Put a little grease on the spindle if it's looking a bit dry. Make sure the tab on the new crank is up, and then slide the crank arm onto the spindle. Use the Shimano crank installation tool to tighten the crank finger tight. This bolt just controls the preload on the bottom bracket bearings. It doesn't have to be super tight, as it's not what holds the crank arm on. It just needs to be tight enough that there's no play in the setup. I usually just do it finger tight and then use a wrench to give it a little extra bit of a turn, mostly because I have pathetically weak fingers. Now that the unit's on the bike, let's talk about connectivity. Magene are always good here. All their products like the speed sensors, the heart rate monitors, the smart trainers, they're all dual ANT Plus and Bluetooth protocols. The Ridge is the same. With ANT Plus, that means you can connect it to your Garmin head unit, or your Wahoo head unit, or even your sports watch if it's ANT Plus enabled. If you have a dumb static trainer and you want to get into Zwift, you can hook this up to Zwift with ANT Plus and start riding in Zwift too. Using the Bluetooth, you can connect the device to a smartphone or some bike computers, but I personally think ANT Plus is better if you have it. When connected to a smartphone, the unit shows up in Strava no problem. Like with most Bluetooth products, they can only connect to one device at a time. During testing, I caused myself a few headaches not being able to find the device on my phone, only to find out it was still connected to Marcus's phone or vice versa. But again, that's a limitation of the Bluetooth protocol more than the device. The device can connect up to your phone and the Magene utility app in order to update the firmware or calibrate the device, etc. I couldn't find the Magene utility app in the Android store, but it was in the Apple App Store. Regardless, there's a link to the APK file on the website, so you can just sideload the app onto your Android devices. What's it like riding with the Ridge? Well, no different than your bike was before. My crank arm weighed just 7 grams more than a stock crank arm, and it's tucked out of the way with no pod sticking down like the old Garmin Vector pedals or anything like that. You really do just forget about it once it's installed, which is the best compliment it can get. But all the convenience in the world is for nothing if it's not accurate and if it's not consistent. Magene claim a 1.5% accuracy on the unit, which is pretty much industry standard for crank-based power meters at this point. They have some graphs on their website showing their unit tracing against other power meters during rides. They put out some videos of those tests too, but I thought I'd verify the numbers for myself. Nothing overly scientific, but I did try to make sure everything was talked to spec, all the firmwares were updated, etc. So these are the results of one of the tests pulled out of Golden Cheetah. So it was a 10-minute test on the static trainer. I had the Garmin Vector 2S on the left side only. The top numbers you can see, the normalized power was 237, the average power 221, and the max power 650. On the left-hand crank side, I also had the Magene Ridge, and you can see the normalized power was 242, so just under 2% higher than the Vector. The average power was 224, so just 1% higher than the Vector, and the max power was 661, again 1.5% higher than the Vector. If we look down at the Magene Gravat Smart Trainer, so this is measured at the wheel, so it doesn't take into account left and right split. So the normalized power 249, 4% higher than the Vector. The average power was 219, so just 1% lower than the Vector. And then the max power 748, a good 15% higher than the Vector. And I think what this was, there were a few small sprints in there, and maybe the small sprints Marcus was riding, maybe his right leg's stronger than his left leg when he's sprinting. Maybe not 15% high, but when you're talking about max power, you're just talking about that one downstroke. And so yeah, maybe when you're really thrashing it, you get a lot more power through one leg than the other. But if we look at the Vector 2S and the Magene Ridge, which are both on the left side, you got super close numbers there. Just 2%, 1%, 1.5% difference. Throughout most of the tests, the Garmin and the Ridge traced each other quite well. Looking at another user's test data with an SRM, some Garmin Vectors and a Ridge, the Ridge seems a little higher than the others, but it's consistently higher. Throughout the testing, there was one occasion when riding up a 14% gradient in the big ring, something you totally shouldn't be doing. And Marcus was pedaling squares, really hammering on the downstroke and then crawling through the dead spot. The Vector was reporting about 25 RPM cadence and around 300 watts of power, but the Ridge seemed a bit confused by the very jerky pedaling and reported around 50 RPM cadence and 600 watts of power. Again, not an everyday situation to find yourself in, but hopefully something that can be fixed through a firmware update. In their 2,500 Ks of testing so far, it only rained on 2 days, and I didn't think this was enough to thoroughly test the waterproofing, so I decided to drop it in a bucket of water. I was too lazy to take off the Garmin Vector 3 pedal, and Marcus didn't have the same faith in his Garmins that I did in the Magene, so the Garmin stayed out of the swimming pool. I can't blame Marcus's lack of faith after the fiasco Garmin had with the battery covers on the Vector 3s though, but after a quick swim, it was time to see if the power meter had survived. At first, I tried just spinning the crank arm in my hands, and my Garmin showed 0 for cadence. Uh-oh, I was starting to feel a bit worried. But after actually reinstalling the crank arm properly on the cranks and pedaling normally, everything was working as it should. So, waterproof or splashproof? Indeed. For anyone using Shimano cranks, I think it's a no-brainer. It's so cheap. Even if you have two bikes, you could buy one for your road bike and one for your cross bike and still be cheaper than a set of Garmin Vector 3s. And you don't have to worry about taking it from one bike to the other. It also means you can use whatever pedals you want. A set of Garmin Vector 3s are 322 grams, compared to 228 grams for some Dura Ace pedals. That's around a 100 gram penalty for the Vector pedals. Whereas my Ridge crank arm was just 7 grams heavier than stock, so it's the lighter option too. And that's all there really is to say about the Ridge. It's a power meter, so there's no talking about how it feels to ride or how it looks. I mean, it either works or it doesn't. And for the Ridge, it just does. 99.9% of the time, it's perfect. If that 0.1% of the time matters for you, then you've got to pay 5-10 times more for a more established power meter from the likes of SRM, Rotor, or Quark, or maybe just wait for a firmware update. For the rest of us who can accept 99.9% as more than good enough, I definitely recommend the Ridge. As usual, any questions about the Ridge or the specifics of the data, let me know in the comments below. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so I can bring you more content like this. The more subscribers I get, the more cool things get sent my way to be reviewed. Anyway, I'll see you next time. China Cycling, out.